Kabbalah, Sefirot, Sitra Achra, Goetic, and modern faiths. The Kabbalah is a very divisive concept within much of modern paganism, Abrahamic mysticism, and even Dharmic religions. It is controversial because for mainstream Abrahamic views, it is shunned as demonic, satanic, and or against God. However, within the depths of theology, for the majority of Abrahamic faiths, it still correlates to a major metaphysical explanation and rituals. Many of the folklore and ritualistic folk practices seen in the Islamic mystical, Christian, and of course Judaic all have connections to the Middle Ages and Kabbalah practices or interpretations. Paganism has issues because there are those of European paganism which want to decouple everything from Abrahamic faiths. I am in one of those camps to a degree, and those who are highly eclectic on the other side who openly mix it in. The thing is, it is hard to separate from Kabbalah because much of paganism, from alchemy to the Middle Ages and Renaissance magical studies, to the occult, and even later Theosophy and Ariosophy, that all had a large impact on current understandings and views of Western mysticism, occult, and even pagan practices, were heavily influenced by Kabbalah. Many things on how the tree of life, runes, and ceremonial magics are viewed could easily be claimed to have come from Kabbalah. And yes, the argument is that these existed prior to Kabbalistic understandings, but used it as a mask to look more Abrahamic and accepted and hide from scrutiny, also due to lack of knowledge. I agree with such a theory, but it does tend to fall short due to the fact that Kabbalah and mysticism itself would also not be accepted on the whole. However, we do know that alchemy was much more widespread and did incorporate a lot of European pagan understanding. What one could easily say is that just how Abrahamic faiths of the big three had direct influence and control over the West, for better or worse, they also directly influenced our understanding of mysticism. This goes beyond just Kabbalah. Concepts such as the greater and lesser keys of Solomon and so-called Solomonic magics with pinnacles, circular glyphs, and the Ars Goetia entities, along with Theurgia, are well-known incorporated into what we have come to understand as occult mysticism and even pagan religion. Historically, the Kabbalah was incorporated into Western mysticism as the Hermetic Kabbalah, or the Germanicized mixing with heathen as the Gothic Kabbalah. Through Swedish and German Romanticism and later Rosicrucian orders continued such. Popular mystics in Britain like Francis Bacon and John Dee further promoted the popularity even further. This has been incorporated into core concepts such as the Galdribok and Nordic or Icelandic magic, or even what people consider Celtic magics due to the advent of Wicca. Of course, you have the popular media that perpetuates these concepts as well. Paimon is a demon who has appeared in multiple horror movies. The Cthulhu mythos uses Goetic-style magics. Almost every fantasy genre or occult sci-fi utilizes the Kabbalah, Solomonic magic, or some interpretation of it. In Japanese animation, manga, and video games, as well as most Eastern views of Western mysticism, the magic of the West is often one amalgamated of Kabbalah, pagan, and ceremonial magic tropes, probably originally inspired from the Dungeons & Dragons or Wizardry game series, as well as general occult. They themselves often see the correlation between their own Shinto, Taoist magics, which use similar symbology and ceremonial concepts, and Buddhist rituals as being very similar and incorporating them as well as syncretic stylings. Of course, one can go on the purest route of Reconstructionism with a pagan approach and separate out as much of these elements as they can, but in the Eurasian context, they will always find that there are parallels to them which still ring true. Why is this? At the risk of playing the devil's advocate, sadly pun intended, I argue that a majority of these commonalities come from Abrahamic faiths incorporating perennial truths and understanding that could be found across Caucasian peoples, Eurasia, and Upper Africa. Many of these concepts existed prior to the spread of Judaism or later adoption into Christianity. Egyptian magics were heavily influential on the majority of the Mediterranean, which already had Mesopotamian magic, which we can observe via Sumerian, Akkadian studies to have similar themes and rituals. If anything was actually Hebraic from the Kabbalah, the majority of it was influenced prior to anything we would consider Abrahamic. Later, we have to see that even the Hebraics were heavily influenced by Persia and thereby Indo-European peoples, and even with that, we had the Phoenician, Greek, and Romans. Concepts of the Tree of Life, the Sefirot, were common in Mesopotamia, Caucasia, Europe, and Tigris Asia. Aligning the world and all mystical concepts within a cosmic world tree, such as which God cross-sectioned into via Sefirot, is very common. And if not as a tree, it can be seen as a mountain in the axis mundi. Often the darker, chaotic, reverse underroots of this tree has realms that are considered evil or associated with the dead, chthonic deities, and chaos. This rings true in the Nordic Celtic with the underworld and other worlds, and the Greco-Roman, as well as the Hittite and other Indo-Europeans. This flip side, or darker world, is Sitra Achra, or Qliphoth. In the Cabala, functions as the darker realms and contains the dark beings. This works as well as in the yin-yang style concept of balance required for both forces, and thereby easily can be seen as correlated with other Eurasian faiths and even in the tantric religions of the Dharmic faith. Of course, some will use the Ars Goetia via an occultic or satanic theme to approach the kings of hell. However, when one sees what demons are invoked, we can easily see that some of them are indeed evil beings representing vice and extreme chaos. Others were demonized pagan deities. This can be seen in the Galderbulk, where the demons called upon were higher Aesir such as Odin, Thor, and Freya, as well as others. The higher side, or more light side, of this being seen as the realms of light, order, or holiness, which contains the deities and aspects of the divine that are good, is also a very common motif, as is the esoteric understanding that one can find in the Hebraic Ein Sof, to where a worshipper becomes one with the divine via approaching these aspects, working their way up to the top where the primary Godhead resides. Other correlations people have found are glyphic, semi-runic, and other geometric symbolism. We can see the Greeks already had a geometric and mathematic cult with Pythagoras and others whereby the golden ratio and triangles were considered divine. In the East, yantra, geometric sacred symbols, as well as circular mandala, which depicted deities for invocation, meditation, and ritual, were already much in use. Hexagrams and pentagrams were well known across Eurasia and used in rituals widely. Much of the magics that were incorporated into what we know as the Kabbalah were already flourishing in the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, Mithraism practices, and general magical cults. The Silk Road took a lot of these elements, much like modern media and trade today, and merged them and commodified them into sacred products that were sold from east to west, with cultural exchanges increasing more and more, not to mention the rise and fall of empires of different cultural and religious backgrounds, which enforced their interpretations, or, in the case of Mongolia, caused much more of a syncretic merger. What we have come to think of as Cabala emerged in the 12th to 13th century, primarily in Spain, and based around the Zohar, which was also a 13th century document. Possibly these had connections to older Hebraic traditions, but the influences of the region were already present upon them, And what Kabbalah would come to express mystically and thematically was using elements that had existed well before. Ultimately, I lean more towards a deconstruction and removal of Abrahamic faiths and interpretations to have an appropriate separation between European, Indo-European, and those faiths. However, I am also of a mystical, shamanic, tantric mindset and practices, as well as one who has researched the occult and general religious history. At the risk of beating a dead horse, I will say again that I tend not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. If one does go down a puritanical purity spiral, trying to rid themselves of all Abrahamic elements, they will discard many of these mystical elements, which on the surface or by presentation may be Abrahamic or Hebraic, but one will be taking away a core element from their own faith and understanding that predates the Hebraic religious influences and or any animosity between such groups. Also, from a shamanic or tantric point of view, the truths and skillful means of tools that are within the presentation of these mentioned mystical or occult elements have their uses. Also, for pagans, your enemies are using these as weapons against you. It would be best to at least know the ins and outs and reclaim the roots of this power. One just needs to be careful when working with such things untrained. Hopefully those of you listening found this breakdown and opinion helpful or at least somewhat interesting. Hammer and Vajra out.